Colleges and universities are in the business of producing and imparting knowledge to students who turn out to become skilled workers in different walks of life. However, this industry has its own challenges. In the past, colleges and universities had little interaction with the courts of law and did not need to employ full-time campus lawyers. But now, we live in the age of tenure denials, lawsuits, free speech battles, and campus sexual assault investigations. It is therefore necessary to ask ourselves the question that, how can colleges and universities respond to legal pressures while remaining true to their educational missions? In this special episode of the book series, I called two professors who recently published a book entitled All the Campus Lawyers: Litigation, Regulation, and the New Era of Higher Education. This book was published by Harvard University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. I spoke with these two professors earlier this morning. Viewers and listeners, I'm happy to be joined by Professor Joyce Jacobsen, and I'm also joined by Mr. Louis Guard. They are both joining me from upstate New York, and we are here to discuss their new book. So I will start by doing the introductions, in which I will want you to just talk about the work that you've been doing. I understand I'm very, very much excited and glad that you are both are well positioned, to author or to co-author this book. I understand Professor Joyce Jacobsen, you previously served as president of Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and Mr. Louis Guard, you are currently serving as the vice president, or maybe let me say the legal advisor of the Hobart and William Smith Colleges. So I want to, just give you an opportunity so that you can explain or describe the kind of work that you do to our audience. I'll begin with Professor Joyce.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much again for having us on your show. We really appreciate it. I'm a professor of economics for many years. I also am a professor at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. So I have been teaching for 36 years on economics. I mostly work on labor economics and gender issues, but as first provost at Wesleyan and then as president at Hobart and William Smith, I became interested in what was going on in higher education. And Lou and I spent a lot of time together on various issues. And I don't even know how we thought of it, but we said, hey, maybe we should write a book about all these things that have happened that we have experienced. And then we taught a course together, which we're teaching again this year, on the law and economics of higher education. And so we wrote the book in real time, basically, while we were teaching the course. There's nothing like having 30 students sitting there waiting for the next chapter to get you to actually finish the book. So we wrote it in that context, then we revised it somewhat afterwards, and then it's come out in April 2024. Our book is called All the Campus Lawyers, and it's been a great honor to work with Lou as well.
So I'm Lou Guard, Vice President and General Counsel here at Hobart and William Smith, and I think Joyce has set the table well for discussing the book. But it was a great pleasure to work together as we were teaching a class. I think it's safe to say that some of the chapters were sped along by the need to have reading material for class for the next day. So that was a helpful tool for us in getting it done. But so as Vice President and General Counsel here, I'm the primary legal advisor to Hobart and William Smith. So support, senior leadership and the Board of Trustees across all areas as it relates to legal needs, legal advice. And I've been doing this for 10 years now. I think I just started my 11th year actually. So prior to that was in private practice. And I think this book is particularly, obviously it's close to my heart because, I'm a co-author of it, but it really, it's the first 10 years of my work in this field, really. It tells the story of the last 10 to 15 years. And, that it's what I've experienced as a practitioner. So before we get into that more discussion of the book, just want to put that out there.
That is great. Thank you so much. So I would want us to get into the discussion of the contents of the book. I understand, you take us through the whole process of the litigation, the experiences that colleges and universities go through with the courts of law, with all the things that happen in higher education, the lawsuits, the challenges to tenure tracks, sexual assault investigations, and all that. What would you say are the core ideas of this book, and what is its central argument?
I think one of the stories we tell, and Lou has really referred to that, is that over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been this real upswing in the amount of, I will say, interference with higher education coming from outside, whether it's, as we point out, from the additional threat of litigation. And we show in our book a huge uptick in the number of cases involving colleges and universities, or whether it's regulation coming mostly from the federal government, particularly the executive branch, or legislation, which we are seeing increasing amounts of. And particularly, I'd like to talk a little later more about particularly the dismantling under legislative impulses of the DEI, basically offices and support and many of the public systems that we're seeing in the US right now. So it's just this incredible upswing. And so we document how this has occurred across many different areas of the university. And so we can go through some of those, but basically each of our chapters kind of shows in a particular area, whether it's student affairs or governance or the economics of higher ed, how this has been occurring over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think make a pretty solid case that it is really pervasive now, that if you are involved in higher education administration, that you also have to be constantly apprised of the legal surroundings of your work.
I've been sort of talking about the book as doing three things. For some reason, my simplistic brain loves to break things down into threes. But one is to just tell this story of the development of the last 10 to 15 years and this increase in litigation regulation. And as Joyce kind of indicated, outside pressures from legal pressures facing colleges and universities. And so we weave that narrative. So in that way, it's a little bit of a history, but then also in so doing, it's, I think, substantively informative to faculty, to higher ed administrators, to trustees, to sort of curious onlookers of the higher education field, because it gives this, I think it gives the necessary context for sort of like, how did we get to where we are today, right now? How did this environment, where did it come from? And so I think we explain that. And then I think another thing the book does, the second main thing, is try to tease out what are the pressure points between this legal system and this recent evolution and the core mission of higher education. Where is the legal system and regulation, litigation, where is it really putting pressure points or pinch points on the core mission of what higher ed does? And then kind of, is that good? Is that bad? What are the pros and cons? What's the best pathway forward? So that's kind of like the second track that I think we explore and thing that the book does. And thirdly, in the last third of the book is really about how to institute a little bit more of a practical manual. I hate the word practical, but kind of a practical manual for higher ed counsel, higher ed leadership. Again, mostly presidents, provosts, trustees, other faculty leadership, folks that are working with their in-house counsel, how do you do it well? What is a good, effective working relationship look like? What are sort of best practices, and what are some of the parameters for how in-house counsel operates? And so I think those are kind of the three things that the book really does, and ways I think it could be useful. And you could see how different constituencies would have a different interest in each of those areas, but they're all kind of interrelated, I think, too.
That's great. Thank you so much. So now, if we look at scholarly discourses on law and education or related literature, if I might say, what would you say is the contribution of the book to the conventional discourse that already exists?
So I would say, I mean, as Lou points out, it's a very practical book on the one hand of really trying to get people up to speed on where we are. There have been other histories of the law of higher education, but nothing that focuses this much on the last 10 to 15 years. And really, we take it from, in particular, there was a Dear Colleague letter for Title IX, and we take that as really one of the big starting points of the book. So we trace back to specific pieces of legislation or particular points, cases, or executive directives when this has started for various issues. I think people have found that useful. We'll talk a little bit later also about how we characterize eras of student affairs in terms of how the university relates to students, and people have found that a useful rubric for thinking about different eras in student affairs and the relationship between students and the university, and how that is now looked through the lens of outsiders again, rather than leaving it to the decisions of the inside of the university folks to do things. So I think it has added to the scholarly discourse in those ways. I mean, this is in some ways a book that falls between categories. We don't do that much economics in it per se, though we do some. And some people have said, well, you should do more in the economics. I feel like that's a whole another book. But it does really highlight this role of the general counsel in ways that others had not noticed, and talks about the rise of that position on campuses, which again, nobody had really given that narrative as thoroughly before.
Sure. Yeah, I think it, as Joyce alluded to, it is probably the most current substantive overview of kind of all the legal issues facing higher education, and we're totally guilty of trying to eat the elephant with one bite. And we say that in the introduction. There are some areas where we're just skimming across the top of the puddle, and then there's other areas where we're 10,000 feet down, and we just had to kind of pick and choose which would get what treatment and why. And I hope it all kind of makes sense and hangs together. I think it does, obviously, but in so do that was just a way to say that it is a comprehensive and accessible. The leading treatise on this topic is 2 volumes, 1,000 pages. I mean, this is 300 pages, and really 175 or so of those are devoted to kind of truncating the current cases and controversies. So really, it's an accessible, I think one of our reviewers called it tour de horizon, but I think that's what it adds to the literature. It's like the kind of the most current, up to speed summary of the legal issues and controversies that you can easily pull off the shelf and access. And Joyce was excellent in the drafting process of keeping my legalese to a minimum and making me water it down and explain it in even more precise prose. So hopefully, the co-author effect net was positive in the sense of making the writing a little more clear, I think, and accessible. But so I think it does that for the legal, from a legal lens, what it contributes to the field. It's like the law of higher education is sort of an interesting amorphous. There's no people that are tenured faculty at law schools who got there simply by doing law of higher education. It tends to be more of a side area of interest for people who are got to where they are by focusing on other things, or it's an area where practicing general counsel kind of take this like side academic interest in it, kind of like I have, and so they're teaching and it grows out from that direction as well. So I think the book kind of pulls all that together and puts it in one place. And I think to the practical side of the book, I think it discusses the profession and the intersection of the profession with higher education in a way that I'm not sure has really been done before, and I think puts it front and center. And I think in that way we'll continue to advance the overall discourse on this topic. How are lawyers influencing higher education, positive and negative? What has the past been? What will the future look like? And I think that's just an important topic that within the legal profession that I think, and within higher education, that I think will continue to get kicked around. So just a couple of thoughts on that.
That's great. That's great. One thing I like about the book is that it does not just appeal to university professionals alone or to academics alone. It even goes to practitioners in all aspects of the space of higher education. So I am very much happy to note that particular strength and aspect of the book. So I want us to get into the discussion of the major findings. What would you say are the major findings of this book, and what major lessons can we draw from them?
Well, let me try to do 2 or 3 of them and then kick it over to Lou to do some more, because there are, again, a number of chapters. And so, as Lou pointed out, higher education law really relates to a number of fields of laws traditionally broken out, including things of civil rights and then free speech. And I'm governance issues, which is more specific to universities, but also comes up for nonprofits and for-profits as well. Let me leave those larger ones to Lou and take other ones that I think, a couple of other ones that I think are important. One is, as I alluded earlier, the student affairs issues. And I think when we started writing the book, we thought that was going to be the less interesting chapter. But as we started thinking more about all the ways in which student issues have come to the forefront, including mental health issues, study abroad issues, accommodations for students under the ADA, it has really become a large area and takes up a lot of time of the student affairs professionals on our campus and others. And if we think back, there have been these eras in student affairs and how the university interacts with students, starting with what I would call the in loco parentis era much earlier, and really for the 19th century up to the 20th, particularly for women's colleges, of the view that the university did act as a parent and control students, particularly female students, during that period. Then in the next period, which starts in the 60s and goes to the 70s and early 80s, which was luckily when I went to college, it was sort of the no holds barred, do whatever period, where we had very little supervision. And I've often said, for instance, I don't think I ever had an administrator come to my room in 4 years of college. And it was a period where the drinking age was lower. There weren't as many issues related to things that we come up with now related to drug use and disease prevention on campus, et cetera. And so then colleges really stepped back and said, well, whatever, you're adults, do whatever you want. And then we've seen a shift more recently to what on the one hand looks like the in loco parentis, where colleges are responsible for students. But the difference is that the outside world doesn't assume that the colleges make the right decisions. So there are many more rules and regulations coming from outside and possibilities of litigation if the colleges don't act correctly to protect students. So one thing that comes up a lot now, for instance, is if there is unfortunately a student death on campus, whether it's a intimate partner event or a suicide or an overdose, there's often subsequently a lawsuit saying that the college or university should have known that this would have happened and have acted to prevent it, which in some cases has gone up against privacy rules and laws in terms of what kind of information can be shared about students' circumstances. But that's one example of the many ways in which colleges and universities are now being held responsible for a much wider range of bad things that could happen to students, both on and off the campuses. So I think that has been a really interesting area. Another area, which was kind of a grab bag chapter for us, looked at the three areas of admissions, advancement, and community relations. In particular, admissions and advancement being really the lifeblood of the university in terms of bringing in, of course, our students, but also the revenue associated with educating the students. And in the case of advancement, bringing in donations and grants to help support the university, because most universities do not run on tuition alone. And so there's a numerous issues. The most obvious issue that's come up there has been related to the changes because of the recent lawsuits that were determined last year that we couldn't use affirmative action principles anymore in determining admissions. And obviously, many colleges and universities were prepared for that to change and have really had to rethink how they do admissions. And so again, that's direct intervention in a college or university's plan on who to admit and how to admit them that has now come down from outside. In advancement, the issues are a little more interesting and subtle. They tend to be more micro issues, though they have showed up at many campuses, including issues about whether names of donors should be stripped off of buildings or other things, because those donors may now be considered to have been inappropriate at various points in their life. And also whether live donors, when they give funds, should be allowed, what level of control they should be allowed in terms of determining how those funds would be spent, and whether they have then the right for suit afterwards. For instance, recently one university wanted to sell some paintings that had been donated, and there have been lawsuits to block those sales. So that kind of thing. I'd say the third thing that I think is very interesting that's happening right now is the dismantling, as I mentioned before, of the DEI apparatus, particularly in many state systems. And interestingly, and we make this case in our chapter on the economics, there has been a huge increase in the ratio and the number of administrators and staff on campus relative to professors. So what's interesting is, on the one hand, you would think, well, if you're going to do away with the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion offices and student support services on campus, well, then you would let people go. But what we are seeing is actually rediversion of resources over to regulating and tracking whether the universities are doing this correctly or not. So it seems like administration manages to continue reproducing itself even as we try to stop some things from occurring, which I just find is fascinating. And we make very clear in the book that we don't see this increase of bureaucratization and legalization as being necessarily either a right-wing or a left-wing phenomena. If anything, it's notable how, regardless of who is in power, whether it was the Trump administration or the Biden administration or which state, that some of this is happening regardless. It may be a little different where you're seeing the bureaucratization, but it's growth of the bureaucracy occurring no matter who is in power. So while there are certain issues which are hot buttons and vary whether you're right wing or left wing, this is kind of a noticeable increase and a shift that occurs no matter who is in charge. I'll leave it there and let Lou take some of these other important topics. I would say mostly for me, the economics is interesting. We're thinking about working some more on the economics because there are so many issues that are coming up as we see increased pressure on institutions. And we do talk about things like mergers and acquisitions, but there's probably a whole other book there on the economics of what is going on right now in higher education.
Yeah, so I mean, Joyce really perfectly summarized, I think, most of it. But one other observation I would make is that I think one of our findings is that there's like even more here than we thought there might have been. I mean, there's even more of an interface between the legal sector and legal issues and higher education than I thought, even though I sort of swim in this pool every day, right? So just when you try to chronicle it all, you're like, holy smokes, this thing just keeps getting thicker and thicker. And then I've continued to notice, we opened the book with this setting the scene of a little college administrator checking their email in the morning, and you get the rundown from the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, and 80% of those articles are legal in nature. It's some new lawsuit, it's some new legislation, it's some tenure issue, it's a free speech issue, whatever it is. And I feel like it has just continued to, it's become more more and more present and more voluminous even since we've written the book. And I mean, the first two chapters of our book on civil rights and on free speech, I think they're practically useful to all sorts of higher ed types and observers, because they frame the legal issues. But then you can just see, in the past 9, 10, 12 months, whatever, since we really kind of submitted the manuscript and it went to press and we couldn't touch it anymore. There are so many changes I would want to make now that just because of new things that have come out. Like we referenced Title VI. It's long been a statute, long been the law, long been memorialized in discrimination policy for any institution receiving federal funds. But the rapid sort of changes that we've seen in that area over the last several months is something that I would love to talk more about. But we do kind of foreshadow, I think, in chapter 1, how this administrative framework works. And so nothing, if you're to read chapter 1, like nothing that you would be learning about now as it relates to Title VI and how the Department of Education is issuing guidance related to Title VI and how that's having an impact on campuses on a daily basis in their operations, like none of that would be a surprise to you. So, there's that, I guess. And then, chapter 2 on speech and all the issues relative to speech. And that's also where we get into tenure a little bit and academic freedom, which, I don't think that I wouldn't call them significant findings, but I think that it's, again, a useful, approachable framework to kind of give the lay of the land. What's the playing field look like for people who care about these issues and who are passionate one way or the other? And I think we set the table well for people to start to understand those issues. And both of those areas those are two chapters where you could have a book on those chapters, right? And several people do have a book on chapter 2, but we tried to, truncate it and make it approachable. So.
Yeah, I think when we do have a chapter at the end of the book where we try to think about what other things will happen next. And one thing that was just starting, which I think has happened a lot more now, are the increased number of unions and movements to treat students as employees of the university. And so that is something we talked about. But again, another thing that Lou said has come up in the next 9 months. So of course, books can't always have every new thing, but I think we do outline these trends that we see occurring. And in fact, our predictions about what things were going to matter more a year after we published the book, including issues about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, have increased additionally. And so I think we have this framework, and to the extent people then fit ideas in, it's part of this larger narrative of the increased control that is occurring in the higher education sector through these legal aspects of litigation and regulation legislation.
That's so great. I'm very grateful of that answer. I just have a small follow-up before we move to the very last question that I have. So now looking at these levels of litigation that go on in higher education, as you highlight in the book, are we moving towards a time in which people who get into administrative positions within the college and university space are going to need to either have a law degree or have some significant knowledge of the law so that they can successfully carry the duties and responsibilities of those offices? What would you say around issues like that?
There does seem to be an increasing trend of lawyers becoming presidents. We have a friend who's written a whole book on that. I don't think that's automatically the case. Most presidents are like myself. They come up through the academic side, usually are the chief academic officer first. And I'd like to think that the main thing, and we just actually wrote a blog post today about advising chief academic officers about how to partner with your general counsel. And that general counsels are so useful because they serve as the in-house authority and local expert on thinking about issues from this legal standpoint. And of course, law school isn't just about knowing specific regulations and legislation. It's about the mindset of thinking for any given event, what are the likely outcomes that it could occur? And certainly when I work with Lou and when I worked with counsel at Wesleyan, one of the things I would say is, you advise me, and often the counsel will say, like, don't do this. It's going to be bad. We're going to get sued. And I would say, well, it's something that we need to do as an institution. Tell me the way to do it that will make it the least likely we get sued, or make it more likely that we'll be able to win or offset any kind of suit or investigation. And so I think it is good to have that partnering of the legal counsel with other decision makers, so that we remember, and I think this is one of the themes of our book, that there's a fundamental mission of universities, and we can't stop doing everything because we're so afraid that we're going to get sued or investigated. And one of the challenges that comes up is particularly the silencing of voices at universities because of concerns about saying something and getting sued. Faculty can be very scared because most of them are not lawyers and they're worried about this. And one of the main jobs of the provost usually and the chief counsel is to reassure them that many things they think will lead to lawsuits will not, and that in general they're indemnified for many things as well. So I don't think everybody should be a lawyer, but we do make a strong case in the book that it's important to really have that legal standpoint when you're taking on many of the things on campus that in previous generations people wouldn't have thought of as having any purview or relevance with the legal side.
Yeah, I think having a law degree is useful. It gives you kind of a mental dexterity that allows you to traverse, I think, a lot of different substantive areas that you need to be familiar with. Some people, I think that for a while there was a movement of like, oh, we need, maybe MBAs will be running colleges and universities, given all the financial pressures and yada yada, and maybe economists will be, and there certainly have been, I think, large waves of economists, and it's still a very frequent pathway for people into leadership positions. But I think the legal education kind of imbues you with the ability to, my wife's a PhD psychologist, and we both were going to graduate school at the same time 1,000 years ago. And when I was kind of getting my chops as a baby lawyer, I remember her saying to me, like, lawyers just think that they can learn everything and they know everything, don't they? Because I was having an argument with her about a psychological issue that really involved, psychological expertise. But I think that's what law school kind of trains you to do. It's like, if you don't know something, you just try to dig in and learn it, and then you take a position on it, even though you don't know everything, and you acknowledge you don't know everything. So it's the blessing and the curse of the law degree.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So now, it's quite clear as to what's the very specific target audience of this. I think we partly touched on this when we were answering some of the first questions, but I want to give you this opportunity so that you can explain it maybe more comprehensively. Who is going to greatly benefit if they get their hands on this book?
Sure. Well, again, we do think that really anybody that is planning to move into higher education administration should read the book, so that they understand the range of legal issues that they may run into, and also understand more how to partner with general counsel. Certainly for presidents and provosts, but I think really even people at, dean level and student affairs, et cetera. I think also people who aspire to become general counsels or have any interest in higher education law coming from the legal side should be reading this book. But I do think the general audiences will find it interesting also. And we've gotten some good reviews from people who are neither lawyers nor administrators about the book, because it does also, in one fairly short book, give you a real range of these issues that are in the news a lot these days. And so I think our book will stand the test of time also as documenting what happened during this era and providing standard going forward, and that it's important to have books like this, that because you think everybody will remember this, but they may not, and to make clear that this was happening at this time historically. I think the book will hold up over the years for that reason as well, but also could be very useful to people who just want to understand what's going on currently. And while it's not an internationally focused book, the U.S. education system is very important. Many people have come from other countries to come here, and for them to understand the kinds of situations that are going on in our very complex and diverse higher education system is important for people who are consumers of education in general, which are really most of us, whether as parents or actively learning or having been to college and universities. It's an area of our economy and our society that really touches everybody.
Viewers and listeners, those of you who would want to get a copy of this book, please do not forget to click the link that is right in the description panel on the upload for this video. I'm very grateful to have had you, Professor Joyce Jacobsen and Mr. Louis Guard. I'm very happy. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you as well for having us on your show.
Thank you.
Great.